Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Jennifer Prediger. I'm a journalist, and I've been covering the DNC for many years now. And I have to say that today's conversation is a very exciting one. So as you all know, the Better Deal was announced earlier last week, though there are some elements of the Better Deal that haven't been fully understood. So luckily, we have a person from the DNC here today, Frank Spencer. He's the Deputy Vice Chair of Civic Engagement, to discuss some of the finer points. For those of you following on our live stream, you can tweet in thoughts, questions, comments to #DNCTakeBack.
All right, thank you so much, Jennifer, and thanks for coming. Lots of people did miss a few of the finer points of the Better Deal. It is a profound turning point in the history of our party and the history of our nation. It takes our party right back to its progressive roots. And this week we're rolling out a series of sort of town halls like this to communicate and get feedback on the finer points that people might have missed, as well as to talk about new directions and solicit your ideas. So please stay tuned. Use the hashtag. This conversation is global. And I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about how we got there. This didn't come out of nothing. As Senator Schumer said last week, when you lose to somebody who has 40% popularity, you've got to take a good, strong look in the mirror and ask yourself what happened. And I want to add that even more importantly than that, you want to ask what you can do differently next time so as to win. And so that is what we've done. Back in December, we started a series of town halls and focus groups to determine what voters across the political spectrum needed and wanted, and what we had failed to provide. And we did that in order to understand how we could address those concerns in the future and win elections as we once did. What we found in our research mirrored the national polls, poll after poll after poll. It also mirrored what was happening in state and local elections across the country again and again. We found that a solid majority of Americans wanted universal government-sponsored health care, and even almost half of all Republicans did. A majority wanted stronger unions, again, across the political spectrum, especially workers, but everyone. 2/3 of Americans wanted tuition-free college. Non-interventionism was very popular. As we know, a number of Trump voters voted that way because of his promises to keep us out of conflicts. Almost everyone in our survey and in the polls thinks that Wall Street has way too much influence, and many people said they would get rid of corporate lobbying altogether. Once we had understood these concerns that we had failed to address, we began to look at how we could do so in the future. And that's when we realized we couldn't. Our hands were tied, in large part because of our donors. Medicare for all would be a disaster for the insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies who are very important donors to our party. They loved Obamacare, which, however, did not lower costs. And Medicare for all, which would, these companies did not like quite as much. Strong unions would be horrible for many of our friends in the management community. The schools that almost all of us hail from might not take so well to the idea of tuition-free colleges, which would bite into some of their profits. It would be pretty hard for military contractors to give up the $400 billion that flows their way, in part stimulated by foreign interventions. And as for preventing corporations from lobbying in government or providing public financing of elections, it's hard to imagine that any of our donors would like that very much. If we were going to have a better deal, if we were going to adopt the positions that could win future elections for our party, we had to begin by severing our donor relationships, which would also pave the way for a more collective kind of support, which was proven to be entirely possible in this last election on both sides of the fight. So after passing a resolution, first proposed by Christine Pelosi in February to prevent corporate donations to the DNC from happening, we adopted a series of similar measures that freed us to champion the most people-friendly, the most vote-getting policies. Medicare for all, strong unions, tuition-free college, non-interventionism, the reduction of corporate influence, the abolition of private prisons, that one was also quite popular across the aisle, and also getting even more firmly behind renewable energy. It turns out that 3/4 of Trump supporters are in favor of renewable energy, in part perhaps because of the large number of jobs it creates. But let me talk about jobs for a minute. Studies suggest that within the next 20 years, almost half of all jobs in the United States could be lost to automation. We don't know whether this will happen, but it's possible. And regardless of whether this does happen, a universal basic income will help all people have a good future, regardless of their position within the wolf-eat-dog hierarchy that is increasingly taking shape in our country. We cannot let corporations or corporate politicians decide how all of this works out. In the past, again and again, the people behind the party of the people stood up against corporations and their politicians to achieve most of the things we call civilized today. Social Security, the 8-hour workday, the weekend, an end to child labor, and so on and so forth. It's time once again for people to decide how the world ought to be, and to stop leaving decisions in the hands of the children who happen to have the most toys. Starting today, the Democratic Party is going to serve the people once again by fighting for what people need and want, and that therefore win elections. And to begin doing that, we're going to aim to outlaw corporate lobbying in government, and we're going to fight for the public financing of elections. That's what the DNC Take-Back is all about, because better just isn't good enough.
I do think that many will perceive these changes as radical.
They're actually very traditional. Our party had very similar platforms that appealed to a large number of people. The emphasis was on appealing to people, and that's how we held on to every single presidency but one for 35 years after the Great Depression. We've seen in elections this year that these sorts of policies work. In places like Georgia, Missouri, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Florida, we've seen very progressive platforms winning. In Jackson, Mississippi, Mayor Lumumba won 93% of the vote, 93 in Mississippi, promising to make Jackson the most progressive city on the planet. Not far from where I'm from in Long Island, a school teacher named Christine Pellegrino won in an area that had gone to Trump by a margin of 23%, and she campaigned on a very progressive platform. You know, these sorts of elections were, of course, a big contrast to the special elections, which mostly featured much more centrist established candidates with the sorts of policies that we have become used to. And so we've seen the writing on the wall. What wins is, at this point, very clear.
I want to go back to universal health care, which you mentioned, and this past week's failure of the Republican take on repealing the Affordable Care Act. And so I'm curious how you see the Democrats reaching across the aisle and providing solutions.
Well, one thing we might reach across the aisle with would be to, admit that Obamacare was not the optimal solution. It was much, much better than nothing, than what we had before, and much better than what has been proposed, if you call it proposing. But it wasn't optimal. It was an accord with the insurance companies. It was immensely popular with the insurance and pharmaceutical companies. It did nothing to reduce costs to the government. We know what would reduce costs. We've long known what would reduce costs. But Medicare for All would not please our largest donors. And this is why it's been so important for us. We have really looked at where these policies come from, why we have not done the logical vote-getting, election-winning things. And we've seen very clearly the source is often in who we are beholden to. And those were choices we made in the 1970s. I mean, power corrupts and money corrupts. And we have ended up with policies that are limited by the desires of those who keep us going. And Obamacare is a prime example. So we do have a solution. We've known it. It's not, in fact, we've known it because the rest of the world has it. And that's, in our country, that would be Medicare, the Medicare system, but expanded to cover everyone. It's not it is a no-brainer.
I'm very happy to hear that the DNC is finally getting a little bit of self-awareness, but does this mean that the Democrats are accepting their fault in the 2008 crisis?
2008 economic crisis. Well, you know, the roots of that crisis you can trace back to policies that Bill Clinton put into place back in the 90s, the deregulation of the banking sector, the end of the separation of the commercial and investment banking, which culminated eventually in removing the oversight over derivatives at the end of the 1990s. That did pave the way for the evolution of more and more complex banking instruments, did help lead to the 2008 crisis and the attendant mass homelessness and mass joblessness and near wreckage of the global economy that led to. And the bailouts of the banks, combined with the crisis itself, were indeed one of the prime causes of the turnaround that we've seen in this last election. Part of it was also the failure of the new Democratic Party today to provide a meaningful alternative. I mean, I think at a certain point we have to stop blaming Russia and look at the role that we ourselves had in this deal so that we can change and become the kind of party that we were long ago.
I worked on a local campaign in Maryland this past year, and our platform is actually a lot more similar to this than the previous DNC platform. However, we were severely handicapped by the fact that we couldn't access the voter activation network, and it was the DNC was charging ridiculous rates for accessing this voter data, and I'm just wondering if you were going to share that toy with us for smaller campaigns, or if you're going to continue to charge ridiculous amounts.
Thank you so much for that question. You know, Social Security, the 8-hour workday, the weekend, an end to child labor, these did not happen through decisions made by higher-up politicians. These happened through mass movements and grassroots action before the word grassroots existed. And we need to look to that model for change. Yes, the Voter Activation Network, we are going to actually make that available for free across the board to legitimate campaigns, as well as legitimate progressive groups, so that this base that was accumulated at such great expense and with such great effort can actually be useful in a movement sense to making some of these big changes that we need to make in this country.
We all are very concerned about money in politics. Moving forward with the Medicare for All universal health care, is the Democratic Party willing to stop taking money from all these big insurance corporations?
Among our biggest donors are the insurance and pharmaceutical companies. And we recognize that we could not offer a popular vote-winning, election-winning solution without the stopping of taking donations from these donors. And Christine Pelosi in February proposed a measure to refuse corporate donations to the DNC, to make it impossible to donate as a corporation to the DNC. We also need to go further than that. It's not enough for the party to refuse donations. We have to actually prevent lobbying in government. Now, it's a form of institutionalized corruption that practically no other developed nation in the world has. Lobbying in government should be illegal. It should be illegal for the largest corporations to have an outsized influence on the people that we want to represent us. We need to hear what policies are bad and what policies have worked and what, and have an actual conversation with the absence or the relative absence of some of the voices that have been in this conversation too loudly. there have been a number of voices that have had megaphones. It's like a megaphone at a party. You know, a cocktail party with a giant megaphone, got one guy with a megaphone. You don't really want that. We got to take that megaphone away so we can all talk. And, you know, I'm obviously talking about the large corporations, the big industries that have had an outsized influence in our democracy.
Hi, ever since I was a young kid, about 12 years old, I've always been interested in politics. And so growing up, I've always been looking forward to registering to vote and being able to participate in politics. And during the 2016 elections, the primary and the general, I found that the Democratic Party was disconnected from the progressive and grassroots policies that they've been known for.
We got very complacent about that for a long time. As we moved more and more to the center, as we moved our fealty, if you will, to a different class than we were built to represent, we became complacent. And we told ourselves that that class that we were made to represent would keep voting for us no matter what. This election was a real wake-up call, where we found that many of the people who had believed the populist messages of 2008 and 2012 did not believe our messages in 2016. Very similar messages, but that was it. They had had enough. And we are looking at that, and we are changing, and you know, that's the nature of politics. You know, things happen, and you change according to what happens. And you know, there's been resistance within the party, but we're finally taking those steps, and we are becoming the kind of party that I think you will be proud of, and we hope millions of people like you will be as well.
With the Medicare for All and universal basic income, how does the party plan, or what does the party support as a way to pay for those programs?
You look across the world and you see developed nations with immensely more generous social programs than we have, doing fine, not suffering, still having high wages, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, our main problem is really not figuring out how to pay for these things. It's figuring out how to talk to our donors and how to talk to the entities and the interests that have kept the Democratic Party floating for the last decades since we made the move towards them. And with that question out of the way, the other questions are simply ones that have faced every developed nation in the world, and they've answered them quite well. So we will too, I think. We're just as smart as France, for example, I think. I mean, I think we have a lot of smart people in this country.
Very smart.
It seems to me a winning strategy needs to be predicated not just on listening, but on providing real leadership. And I don't see the current establishment of Democrats being in any kind of position to provide that kind of stand-up leadership, to call it as it is, and to lead people forward. The people that are in power now, they were great in their time, Feinstein, Pelosi, all of them, but they're so identified by the masses as being part of the old pink Democratic Party. Do you think the current leadership is prepared to step aside and have some fresh faces come forward and represent these ideas and really provide leadership and calling it like it is to the majority of the people?
Yeah, very good question. And the answer is I do. The DNC, as a policy, is going to support candidates, is going to throw our weight behind candidates who espouse the sorts of platforms that haven't been seen in the last couple of decades at least. But this is only a start. We're hoping over the next several months to get to a point where we can say, yes, we will have some of the older Democrats step aside. We will have some, not older, but some of the more centrist ones, perhaps the ones whose policies have proven themselves not to work so well, step aside. Some of the highest profile members of the Democratic Party are going to be making some announcements this next week, following up on this to clarify what the better deal really is, what DNCTakeBack is all about. We've seen again and again voices at the state and local level speaking up and winning, even in very heavily Trump-supporting areas. So if we can see those kinds of voices winning locally, it's sort of like the writing is on the wall, and anybody can see it.